Welcome to Days of Old Voice, where we uncover the hidden truths behind history's most romanticized stories. I'm your host, and today we're revealing a story that Hollywood got completely wrong. When you think of Princess Sisi of Austria, you probably imagine a fairy tale romance, beautiful ballrooms, and happily ever after. But the real story is far darker than any film has ever shown you. This is the true account of how a 15-year-old girl was trapped in a forced marriage that slowly destroyed her over 4 decades. The truth behind the crown, the jewels, and the legend is heartbreaking. Let's begin. The tragic story of Princess Sisi of Austria's forced marriage. In the glittering ballrooms of Vienna, beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Hofburg Palace, a beautiful young girl was about to have her entire life stolen from her. Not by violence or conquest, but something far more insidious. A crown, a title, and a marriage she never wanted to a man she barely knew. And this is the true story of Elisabeth of Bavaria, known to history as Sisi, who at just 15 years old found herself trapped in a gilded cage that would slowly destroy her spirit, her health, and ultimately lead to one of history's most tragic endings. When we think of princesses and empresses, we imagine fairy tales, romance, and happily ever after. But Sisi's story is the dark reality behind the royal fantasy. A cautionary tale about the brutal machinery of dynastic politics, the suffocating expectations placed on royal women, and how even unlimited wealth and power cannot protect someone from profound unhappiness when their fundamental freedom is taken away. To understand the tragedy of Sisi's forced marriage, we must first travel back to the summer of 1853, to the Bavarian village of Possenhofen on the shores of Lake Starnberg, where a spirited, unconventional 15-year-old girl lived a life of relative freedom that was about to end forever. Elisabeth Amalia Eugenie, Duchess in Bavaria, was the 4th child of Duke Maximilian Joseph and Duchess Ludovica. And unlike most noble children of her era, she had been raised with unusual freedom, spending her days riding horses through the countryside, writing poetry in her private journals, and wandering the forests and lake shores near her family's summer residence with minimal supervision or constraint. Sisi was not being groomed for greatness or prepared for a significant royal marriage. She was considered pretty, but not the beauty of the family. That distinction belonged to her older sister, Helene, called Nene, who was everything a proper 19th-century princess should be: demure, obedient, accomplished in the feminine arts, and most importantly, she was the one who had been carefully selected and prepared to marry the young Emperor Franz Joseph, the First of Austria, one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. The plan had been orchestrated by Sisi's mother Ludovica and her sister, Archduchess Sophie of Austria, Franz Joseph's domineering mother, who effectively controlled the Austrian Empire from behind the throne, and was determined to arrange a proper marriage for her 23-year-old son that would strengthen the Habsburg dynasty and keep power within the family. In August 1853, Ludovica traveled to the Austrian resort town of Bad Ischl with both Helene and Elisabeth, ostensibly so that Franz Joseph could meet and become engaged to Helene in what was supposed to be a carefully choreographed diplomatic courtship. But fate, or perhaps human chemistry, had other plans. When Franz Joseph first saw the two sisters, something unexpected happened that would change the course of history and destroy a young girl's life. He completely ignored the carefully prepared Helene and became instantly obsessively infatuated with the younger, livelier, more natural Elisabeth, who had only come along as a companion to her sister and had no preparation, no training, and no expectation of attracting the emperor's attention. For Franz Joseph, a young man who had been raised in the rigid formality of the Habsburg court, drilled in duty and protocol since childhood, and surrounded by scheming courtiers and political calculations his entire life, Sisi must have seemed like a breath of fresh air, a genuine, unaffected girl who laughed freely, spoke her mind, and represented everything his controlled, formal existence lacked. Within days, Franz Joseph informed his mother that he would marry Elisabeth and no one else, and Sophie, despite her careful planning and preference for the more suitable Helene, realized she could not refuse her son without creating a dynastic crisis, so she reluctantly agreed, and the engagement was announced on August 19, 1853, just 3 days after Franz Joseph and Sisi had first met. For 15-year-old Elisabeth, the whirlwind courtship must have been overwhelming, flattering, and terrifying all at once. She had suddenly become the center of attention of one of Europe's most powerful men. She was being told she would become Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary, one of the most prestigious positions in the world. And yet she barely knew Franz Joseph, had no understanding of what her life would become, and was being given no real choice in the matter. The engagement period was brief, just 8 months, and during that time, Sisi remained in Bavaria while preparations were being made for a wedding that would be one of the grandest spectacles of the 19th century. But already the machinery of the Habsburg court was beginning to close around her like a trap. Archduchess Sophie immediately took control of Sisi's preparation, sending detailed instructions about her education, her wardrobe, her behavior, and her schedule, attempting to transform the free-spirited Bavarian girl into a proper Austrian empress in just a few months. And Sisi, who had never been subjected to such rigid control and expectations, began to experience the anxiety and stress that would plague her entire married life. On April 20th, 1854, just 3 days before her 17th birthday, Elisabeth traveled down the Danube River to Vienna in a ceremonial barge, passing cheering crowds who had no idea they were watching a lamb being led to slaughter. And she arrived at a city that would become her prison, her torture chamber, and the place where her spirit would slowly be crushed over decades of suffocating court protocol and political manipulation. The wedding took place on April 24, 1854, in the Augustiner Kirche in Vienna, with all the splendor and pageantry the Habsburg Empire could muster. Thousands of spectators, visiting royalty from across Europe, elaborate ceremonies, and a wedding dress that weighed so much Sisi could barely walk. And throughout the ceremony, this frightened teenage girl had to smile and play her part while marrying a man she had spent perhaps a dozen hours with in her entire life. The wedding night was reportedly traumatic for Sisi, who was a sheltered, innocent girl with little understanding of physical intimacy, and Franz Joseph, despite his genuine affection for her, was a product of his time and upbringing, viewing the consummation of the marriage as a duty to be fulfilled rather than an experience to be shared with sensitivity and care. From the very first day of her marriage, Sisi found herself trapped in a world of suffocating protocol and rigid hierarchy that governed every moment of her existence. She could not take a walk without permission, could not choose her own clothes without approval, could not eat a meal without following elaborate rules about timing, courses, and conversation, and most devastatingly, she had almost no privacy or personal freedom whatsoever. The Habsburg court operated according to an elaborate Spanish court protocol that had been established centuries earlier, a Byzantine system of rules that dictated everything from who could speak to the empress and when, to how she should dress, move, and even think. And Elisabeth, who had grown up running wild in the Bavarian countryside, found herself imprisoned by invisible chains of etiquette and expectations that were more binding than any physical constraints. Making matters infinitely worse was her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, who had never wanted Elisabeth as a daughter-in-law in the first place, and was determined to mold her into a proper Habsburg empress, even if it destroyed the girl's spirit in the process. Sophie controlled every aspect of Sisi's life, from her daily schedule to her wardrobe, from her public appearances to her private time with her husband, and she made it clear that Elisabeth was merely a vessel for producing Habsburg heirs, not a person with her own thoughts, feelings, or desires. When Sisi gave birth to her first child, a daughter named Sophie, after her mother-in-law in March 1855, just 11 months after her wedding, the baby was immediately taken away from her and placed under Archduchess Sophie's control, with Sisi given minimal access to her own child and no say in how the baby was raised, educated, or cared for. This pattern repeated with her second daughter Gisela, born in 1856, and Elisabeth found herself trapped in a nightmare where she was forced to bear children who were then stolen from her, where she was treated as a breeding machine rather than a mother, and her mother-in-law wielded absolute power over the most intimate aspect of her life. The psychological toll on Sisi was devastating. She began to suffer from depression, anxiety, and what we would now recognize as symptoms of anorexia nervosa, an eating disorder driven by her desperate need to control something, anything in her life when everything else was controlled by others. Elisabeth became obsessed with maintaining an impossibly thin figure, restricting her eating to dangerous levels, exercising compulsively for hours a day, and developing elaborate beauty rituals that took